Late on a Tuesday afternoon in October, when I finally managed to get my daughter-in-law on the phone, the first words out of her mouth were, "Did you receive the invoice I sent?" No greeting, no "Hello, Gerald," not even a simple "How are you?" Just a blunt question about the invoice. I told her that yes, I had seen it. "Good," she replied. "The supplier expects payment by Friday, or they'll delay the next shipment." I said I would check on it. Before I had the chance to ask the question that had actually prompted my call, the line went dead. For a while I remained standing in my kitchen in Oakville. The phone pressed lightly against my chest. Staring through the window at the backyard I had spent 3 decades tending. The maple tree in the corner had turned a deep, brilliant red. Patricia, my wife, would have admired it, calling it stunning the way she always did this time of year. She's been gone 4 years now, yet there are still moments when I instinctively turn, ready to share something with her before remembering she isn't there. The question I had meant to ask my daughter-in-law was straightforward enough. When exactly is the grand opening? My son Trevor had been preparing to launch his wellness clinic for nearly 2 years. The place, a physiotherapy and rehabilitation center he decided to name Cedarbrook, was meant to represent the peak of everything he had worked toward: his education, the years he spent learning under experienced practitioners, and the $340,000 I had contributed from the savings Patricia and I had built through an entire lifetime of steady work. After 31 years teaching high school mathematics, I had finally retired. Patricia had worked as a hospital administrator for most of her career. We were never wealthy, but we lived carefully, saving little by little with patience and discipline. So when Trevor came to me 2 springs ago carrying a carefully written business plan and a hopeful dream, I believed in him with the kind of faith only a father can place in his son. I never asked for a seat on his board of directors. I didn't insist that my name appear on the sign outside. The only thing I requested was simple: keep me in the loop and treat me not like an investor, but like his father. For the first few months, that's exactly what he did. Every Sunday we talked. He would explain the renovations in detail, update me on equipment orders, and tell me about the hiring process. Sometimes he even sent photos. Once he called me from the clinic site, his voice full of excitement when the new treatment tables were delivered. Those were good months. Eventually, Trevor's wife, Renata, stepped in to handle the clinic's finances. I try to be fair when I think about Renata. She's efficient, highly organized, and there's no doubt she cares deeply about Trevor. But the moment she took charge of the clinic's administrative side, something Trevor explained to me with a slightly embarrassed tone, saying she had experience in healthcare management, things began to shift. Our Sunday phone calls grew shorter. Then they started happening less often. Eventually they stopped completely, replaced by the occasional text message and the random invoice forwarded to my email. I kept telling myself it was nothing unusual. Businesses become demanding. Sons build their own lives. I had read enough advice columns buried in weekend newspapers to know that a father who holds on too tightly eventually becomes a burden. Still, there is a quiet but important difference between choosing to step back and being quietly edged out. At the time, I was only just starting to realize which of those was happening to me. The Friday after that call about the invoice, I decided to drive out to see the clinic. It had been 3 months since my last visit. Sometime during the summer, Renata had casually mentioned that the construction noise made surprise visits difficult, so I had stayed away out of respect. The trip from Oakville to the west end of Hamilton took about 40 minutes. Along roads Patricia and I had driven many times years ago when we would go see her sister. Parking was easy to find, and the street itself was unusually quiet for a Friday afternoon. As I approached the building, I slowed and then stopped completely. There were plants sitting in the window. Framed artwork hung on the interior walls, clearly visible from the sidewalk. Above the entrance was a sign, "Cedarbrook Wellness and Rehabilitation," printed in simple navy lettering against a clean white background. It looked tasteful and professional, nothing flashy. The clinic was open, obviously, unmistakably open. Through the glass door I could see a reception desk. A woman sat there typing steadily at a computer. In the waiting area, 2 people held clipboards while they filled out forms, but I didn't step inside. Instead, I remained on the sidewalk for what felt like a very long time, quietly doing the math in my head. The sign above the door didn't look freshly installed. It had that slightly worn appearance that comes after time and weather. The plants in the windows had clearly grown into their pots, and along the bottom edge of the lettering above the door, there was a faint water stain where rain had run down the wall. I went back home. That evening, I tried calling Trevor. After 3 rings, the call went straight to voicemail. I dialed again the next morning. 2 rings this time, and then voicemail again. He was deliberately sending me to voicemail. My own son. I sat with that realization for the rest of the day before finally deciding to call Renata. She picked up on the very first ring, and that alone told me something. "When did the clinic open?" I asked. There was a brief silence. Not long, just long enough to notice. "The soft opening was about 6 weeks ago," she said. "We did a quiet launch, just family and a few close colleagues." I let that settle in my mind. I hadn't been invited. Trevor wanted to keep it low-key, she added. "You know how he gets about pressure." Yes, I knew exactly how Trevor got. He had been a sensitive child, easily overwhelmed before recitals, before exams, before anything that truly mattered to him. All his life, I had done what I could to shield him from unnecessary stress. What I had never imagined, in all my 63 years, was that my presence at an important moment in my son's life might somehow be considered unnecessary stress. "Renata," I said, keeping my voice steady. 30 years of teaching had taught me the value of a calm tone. I put $340,000 into that clinic, and we're very grateful for that, she replied quickly. "Trevor will call you this week." He didn't call. Not that week. I've never been someone who acts on impulse. Patricia used to joke about that part of me, saying I could turn the simple act of ordering dinner into a philosophical debate, but careful thought isn't the same as doing nothing. And as the days passed without a single call from my son, I began, quietly and methodically, to do what any reasonable person would do if they suspected they were being handled instead of respected. I started paying attention. I pulled out my records, every bank transfer, every receipt, every email connected to the clinic over the previous 2 years, and began reviewing them one by one. I have always been meticulous with documentation, a habit that comes naturally to someone who spent decades teaching mathematics. When I spread everything across the dining room table and began examining it carefully, a clearer picture slowly emerged, one that had previously been hidden beneath all the small details. The original arrangement between Trevor and me had never been turned into a formal contract. In fact, I had suggested drafting one in the beginning. Trevor had reacted with visible hurt. "Dad, this is family," he said, and I remember feeling embarrassed for even bringing it up. Looking back now, I realized that reaction may have been exactly the point. What I did have was a long thread of emails. In those messages, Trevor referred to my contribution as an investment under family terms. By that he meant there would be no formal interest and no strict repayment schedule. Instead, there was an understanding that I would remain a silent partner who would at least be kept informed about any major developments. Those were his words, written plainly in his own emails, and by any reasonable definition, the grand opening of the clinic certainly counted as a major milestone. As I continued reviewing the paperwork, other things began to stand out. I noticed a pattern in the invoices Renata had been forwarding to me. There were equipment purchases I didn't remember approving. A consulting fee appeared every month, paid to a numbered company I didn't recognize. There was also a vague expense listed simply as business development, quietly deducted from the clinic's operating budget. Meanwhile, my money was still being drawn down month after month for 11 straight months. I'm not an accountant, but I did spend 31 years teaching students how to follow the logic of numbers, and the logic in front of me was starting to say something I wasn't ready to accept. So I called an old friend of mine, Douglas. He had retired from corporate law 3 years earlier and now spent most of his time sailing out of Burlington. We met for lunch at a small diner near the harbor. I brought the emails. I brought the invoices. I spread them across the table between our coffee cups and let him look through everything. Douglas read quietly for a long time without saying a word. Finally, he looked up and asked, "Gerald, do you happen to know who owns that numbered company?" I told him I didn't. He slid his reading glasses down slightly and studied me over the frames. "You should find out." I eventually brought in a bookkeeper to examine everything more carefully. A retired woman named Carol, who took on contract work and had a reputation for asking very few questions. I asked her to review the entire financial trail, every dollar I had contributed, and every charge that had been applied against it. She spent 2 weeks going through the records. When she returned, she handed me a 4-page summary of her findings. The moment I saw the expression on her face, I recognized it immediately. After 30 years of meeting with parents about struggling students, I knew that look well. The quiet seriousness people wear when they're about to deliver news someone won't enjoy hearing. The numbered company I had noticed earlier was receiving a consulting fee from the clinic every single month. According to the corporate records Carol uncovered, the listed director of that company was Renata's brother, a man named Paul. From everything I could gather, Paul had no particular background in healthcare management, physiotherapy, or anything remotely related that would justify a monthly consulting payment of $2,800. Over 11 months, that added up to $30,800 taken directly from the clinic's operating budget, effectively from the investment I had made. There were other details in Carol's report, but that one stayed with me. It settled in my mind like a heavy stone dropped into still water. I didn't call Trevor. Not yet. First, I needed time to think. I needed to see the entire shape of what I was dealing with before I said a single word. This is probably the point in the story where another kind of man might have jumped into his car, driven straight to Hamilton, and confronted everyone involved, but dramatic confrontations rarely accomplish much. Patricia used to remind me of that. You don't win by shouting, she would say. You win by being the last one still sitting at the table. Through a mutual acquaintance, the husband of a former colleague who had once done business with Cedarbrook's landlord, I managed to review a copy of the clinic's lease agreement. I won't go into detail about how I obtained it. Let's just say it wasn't a process that reflects particularly well on anyone involved. What mattered was what the document revealed. The lease had been signed with a personal guarantee, not by Trevor and Renata together, by Trevor alone. Whatever explanation I had been given about the structure of the business, the financial risk was resting entirely on my son's shoulders. His wife hadn't signed alongside him, and there was no corporate structure shielding him from personal liability. If the clinic failed, Trevor would be the one responsible for every dollar. I still don't know whether Renata understood that when she approved those consulting payments to her brother. I don't know what discussions happened inside their home, conversations I was never part of. What I did know was this: my son was carrying a financial burden he might not have fully understood, while the person overseeing the clinic's finances was directing part of that money toward her own family. I called Trevor on a Sunday morning. He answered on the 5th ring, "Dad." His voice sounded exhausted, not startled, just worn, like someone who had been expecting a difficult conversation and hadn't slept well waiting for it to arrive. "I'd like to come by the clinic," I said. "Not as a surprise. I'm letting you know now. Tuesday afternoon." There was a pause. "Sure, Dad. I'd like Renata to be there as well." Another pause. This one longer. "I can ask her." "Please do." The meeting on Tuesday wasn't easy. Over the weekend, I prepared for it the same way I used to prepare for difficult parent-teacher conferences. Carefully, methodically, and without anger. My goal wasn't punishment. My goal was clarity. I brought Carol's summary. I brought copies of the emails Trevor had written. I also brought the information about the lease. Trevor and Renata met me in the small office at the back of the clinic. Trevor looked as if he hadn't slept in days. Renata, on the other hand, appeared perfectly composed, the sort of composure people wear when they've practiced it ahead of time. I laid the documents out on the desk between us. "I'd like us to go through these together," I said quietly. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours. I won't recount every detail because those belong to my family and not to anyone else. But the general shape of it is this. Renata explained that Paul's consulting payments were legitimate, claiming he had helped during the clinic's setup phase. Trevor said he hadn't realized the full extent of what had been charged. Renata insisted Trevor had been aware. Trevor admitted he had approved the idea of consulting support in general, but hadn't examined the specific payments closely. Watching it unfold was painful, not necessarily because I believed they were lying, though there were moments when I couldn't be sure. What hurt most was something else entirely. I could see my son sitting there across from his own wife, and for the first time with me present as a witness, he seemed to be realizing that the two of them remembered the story very differently. This was the boy I had raised, the man I had trusted enough to invest my retirement savings in. And now he was sitting in that chair, slowly recognizing that the versions of events inside his own marriage did not line up. I never raised my voice. I made no threats. When the 2 hours finally came to an end, I said only one thing: I need this formally acknowledged. A written accounting of every dollar spent, and a repayment plan for the money that went to Paul's company. Not because I desperately need the money, Trevor, but because I need to know we are operating honestly. Renata said she would need time to consult with her accountant. Of course, I replied. I'll give you 2 weeks. As I was leaving, Trevor followed me to the door while Renata remained behind in the office. He stood on the front step with his hands buried in his pockets, staring out across the parking lot. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said quietly. "I know you are. I didn't realize she was paying Paul that much." I studied my son for a long moment, and I believed him. I believed he had signed documents without reading them carefully, trusting his wife to manage the details he preferred not to handle. I believed he had poured his energy into building a beautiful clinic while standing on a foundation he had never fully examined. In truth, I had watched Trevor do a version of this his entire life. He had always been the dreamer, the one with the vision, the big ideas, the ambition, but he had also always relied on others to manage the practical side of those dreams. It was both a strength and a weakness, and in this case, someone had taken advantage of it. "That's something you're going to have to fix," I told him. "Not for me, for yourself." I drove back to Oakville that afternoon as the light was starting to fade. Traffic along the 403 crawled along at its usual slow pace, but I wasn't in any hurry. I turned on the CBC out of habit, something Patricia had always insisted on whenever we were in the car, and simply let the drive unfold at its own pace. 2 weeks passed. Then, on a Thursday morning, I received a document prepared by Renata's accountant. It contained a complete breakdown of the clinic's expenses up to that point, including the consulting payments made to Paul. Altogether, it totaled $34,200 in charges I had never explicitly approved. Attached to the report was a proposal for repayment, monthly installments spread over 18 months to be paid from the clinic's projected revenue. I went over the document with Douglas during a phone call. After reading through it carefully, he said it seemed fair. I told him I was willing to accept the terms, but only with one additional condition, that from that point forward, any expense over $5,000 would require my written acknowledgement. Renata agreed to it. She didn't sound particularly pleased, but she agreed nonetheless. What followed after that unfolded more quietly. Without the sharp tension of the earlier weeks, Trevor and I began speaking again on Sundays. The conversations were different now, shorter in some ways, more cautious, but they were also more truthful. He started telling me things he hadn't said before. The clinic's first 3 months had been far more difficult than he expected. He admitted he had been too embarrassed to tell me about the struggles because he didn't want to disappoint me. He also confessed that the disagreements about money between him and Renata had begun long before I was ever pulled into the middle of them. I told him he could have come to me with those problems. I told him that if a father cannot listen to hard truths from his own son, then he isn't the kind of father a son can rely on. And I had always hoped, still hoped, that I was someone he could trust that way. I had never been invited to the grand opening. I never stood at the entrance of the clinic I helped make possible, shaking hands with Trevor's colleagues, or feeling the quiet pride a parent feels when witnessing a child's achievement. That moment had been taken from me, and I won't pretend it didn't matter. But in December, on a Friday evening, Trevor called and asked if I would come by the clinic for an early Christmas dinner, just the 3 of us, him, Renata, and me. He said we'd eat in the small staff kitchen at the back, with takeout from the Lebanese restaurant next door. I said yes. So I found myself sitting at a folding table inside my son's clinic, surrounded by takeout containers, with a simple string of lights Trevor had hung along the window. As we ate, I thought about Patricia. I thought about the 31 years I had spent teaching other people's children how to follow the logic of numbers, and I thought about what it truly means to invest in something. Money, in the end, is the easy part. You gather it slowly over time, and then with a single decision you release it into the world where it no longer belongs to you. The harder investment is the other kind, the one you make in a person over decades, through patience, through presence, through the quiet decision to remain at the table even when the accounting becomes complicated. I don't know whether Trevor and Renata have truly worked through everything between them. That's their responsibility, not mine. What I do know is that during that dinner, my son looked across the folding table at me and said, "None of this would exist without you." And he wasn't talking only about the money. I'm 63 years old now. I've buried my wife, closed the chapter on a long career, and faced more difficult conversations than I could possibly count. If there's one lesson I keep returning to, the one I would offer to any parent who might one day find themselves in the place I once sat, it's this: a contract is not a sign of distrust, it is a sign of respect. It says, "I take this seriously enough to put it in writing." It says, "I believe in this enough to make it real." Trevor's clinic is doing well now. The repayments arrive on the first day of every month without fail. On the second Tuesday of each month, I stop by the clinic, and Trevor sits down with me over coffee to give a short update. Patient occupancy, new referrals, equipment maintenance. In the spring, he purchased a new ultrasound machine. Before signing the purchase order, he called me to ask for my acknowledgement. That phone call, the simple act of asking before spending the money, meant more to me than any grand opening ceremony ever could have. I'm not a man who needs to be celebrated. I'm a man who needs to be included. There's a difference between the two, and sometimes it takes losing one to understand the other. If you are a parent who has given a child your money, your time, your trust, and you've started to feel as though you're being managed instead of respected, then hear this clearly. Your feelings are information. Don't dismiss them. Don't convince yourself you're being unreasonable or demanding. And don't believe that love requires silence. Ask the question. Read the documents. Request the accounting. And if your child is worth believing in, and most of them are, they will sit across from you at that table, even when it's uncomfortable. And they will work through it with you. That is what family means. Not the absence of difficulty, but the willingness to face it together. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, A Father's Wrath, for more real family stories, lessons, and experiences.